Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today at a moment when the truth of our economic reality is far more alarming than what we are being told. The crisis we face is not a passing storm, nor is it merely a cycle that will correct itself with time. No, this crisis is deeper, sharper, and far worse than most people realize. For too long, we have been encouraged to see these struggles, rising costs, stagnant wages, collapsing public services as isolated problems. But they are not isolated. They are symptoms of a system under immense strain, a system whose very foundations are cracking. This is not simply about a stock market fluctuation or a temporary inflation spike. This is about structural weaknesses in the economy that have been ignored, denied, and papered over for decades. And who pays the price? Not the wealthy corporations that enjoy bailouts, not the elites who have the resources to shield themselves. It is the working men and women, the families struggling to make ends meet, the young people drowning in debt, and the elderly facing insecurity after a lifetime of labor. The real burden of this crisis rests on their shoulders. Yet, instead of confronting these realities, political leaders reassure us with empty promises. They speak of recovery while millions face insecurity. They talk of growth while wages stagnate. They present statistics that hide more than they reveal. And through it all, those at the top continue to profit, even as the majority suffer. This crisis, my friends, is a turning point. Either we continue down a path of denial and widening inequality, or we begin to ask the hard questions. Why are we allowing a system to function this way? Why are we tolerating policies that benefit the few at the expense of the many? Why are we not demanding an economy that serves people instead of profits? The future depends on how honestly we face this moment. If we want real change, it will not come from waiting for leaders who have already failed us. It will come from collective action, from organizing, from demanding accountability and fairness. Only then can we turn a crisis of despair into a possibility for transformation. The truth about the crisis we are living through is that its depth and severity are not widely recognized. What most people see is the surface, the rising prices at the grocery store, the news about layoffs, or the pressure of paying rent while wages barely move. These are visible signs, but they only scratch the surface of something much larger and more dangerous. The reality is that the crisis is not simply about inflation or a slowing economy. It is a convergence of structural failures, decades of policy mistakes, and deep inequalities that have been allowed to grow unchecked. To understand this, we must pull back the curtain and see how the problems are connected, not separate. For years, the narrative has been shaped by institutions, media, and leaders who insist that downturns are temporary, that markets are resilient, and that the system is fundamentally sound. They tell us to be patient, to trust that recovery will come. But what goes untold is that the very mechanisms that are supposed to stabilize the economy are now fueling instability. The debt levels, both public and private, are historically unsustainable. Families borrow just to maintain basic living standards. Corporations borrow to buy back their own shares instead of investing in workers, and governments borrow to keep patching holes that grow larger with every crisis. What looks like resilience on the surface is in fact a fragile house of cards. When people hear that unemployment is low or that stock markets are high, they are led to believe the economy is in good shape. But these indicators hide more than they reveal. A job today might mean part time hours, no benefits, and no security. A booming stock market benefits the top 10% who hold the overwhelming majority of shares, while most workers own little or nothing at all. The wealth gap, already extreme, is widening even further. So while statistics tell one story, lived reality tells another. The contradiction between the two is where the hidden depth of the crisis lies. This crisis is not only economic in the narrow sense, it is social and political as well. As ordinary people feel the squeeze of rising costs and insecure futures, trust in institutions erodes. People see that their sacrifices are not leading to stability, but to deeper precarity. They notice that corporations record profits in the very years when their own bills double and triple. They notice that politicians argue endlessly but deliver little relief. The result is a growing disillusionment, a sense that the system is rigged and that no one in power is truly looking out for them. This erosion of trust is itself a crisis because it undermines the foundations of democracy and social cohesion. Another layer that makes this situation worse than most realize is the global dimension. The world economy is deeply interconnected. A financial shock in one country ripples outward quickly, disrupting supply chains, currencies, and trade everywhere. We have already seen how fragile the global system is, whether through pandemics, wars, or financial speculation. When people think about crisis, they often imagine it contained within national borders. But today, a disruption in one part of the world can create shortages, inflation, and instability thousands of miles away. This interconnected fragility means that recovery is not just difficult, it is unpredictable and precarious. The hidden severity also lies in how long term problems have been allowed to accumulate without resolution. Inequality has been rising for decades, and instead of addressing it, leaders treated it as an unavoidable feature of modern economies. Public services have been underfunded, education and healthcare have been turned into profit driven industries, and infrastructure has decayed. These weaknesses are not immediately visible during periods of calm, but when a crisis hits, they magnify the impact. Suddenly, millions cannot afford medical care, young people cannot find affordable housing, and communities lack the resources to respond effectively. What should have been cushions against hardship instead become amplifiers of it. The most dangerous aspect of this crisis, and the reason it is far worse than it appears, is the denial. By refusing to name the problems for what they are, systemic failures, leaders offer band aid solutions. They may lower interest rates, increase subsidies temporarily, or send out stimulus checks, but these measures do not address the root causes. Instead, they delay reckoning, ensuring that the next crisis will be even larger. Each cycle of denial compounds the damage, like pushing debt further into the future or ignoring a structural crack in a building until it threatens collapse. What the public sees are the immediate hardships: paying more for food, struggling with debt, or feeling insecure about the future. But what they do not see is that these hardships are not temporary. They are part of a deeper transformation of the economy, one that has been moving toward greater instability and inequality for decades. The surface symptoms distract from the structural sickness. That is why this crisis is far worse than most realize, because its roots run deeper, its consequences stretch further, and its solutions require far more than the piecemeal measures being offered today. When people hear the word crisis, they often think of it as a temporary downturn, a difficult period in an otherwise healthy economy that will eventually rebound. But the truth is more sobering. The difficulties we face are not simply the result of external shocks or bad luck. They are rooted in the very structure of the economic system itself. What we are living through is not a passing problem. It is the outcome of flaws deeply embedded in capitalism, flaws that make crises not just possible, but inevitable. To understand why this crisis feels so inescapable, we must look closely at how the system is designed to operate and why that design keeps producing instability. Capitalism is often described as efficient, innovative, and self correcting. We are told that markets allocate resources wisely, that competition drives progress, and that growth benefits everyone in the long run. Yet, history tells a different story. If we examine the record over the last 2 centuries, we find a recurring pattern every few years or decades. Economies organized under capitalism experience major crises, recessions, depressions, financial panics. These are not accidents, nor are they the results of mismanagement by a few bad actors. They are systemic, built into the very rules of the game. A system that rewards profit above all else inevitably generates instability because profit making often comes at the expense of long-term stability. Consider how businesses operate within capitalism. Their survival depends on cutting costs and maximizing returns. That means constant pressure to reduce labor costs, to automate, to outsource, and to push workers harder. This pursuit of efficiency may increase profits, but it leaves millions of workers insecure, underpaid, and disposable. At the same time, businesses seek to expand into new markets to grow endlessly. But endless growth in a world of finite resources is unsustainable. Sooner or later, the contradictions appear. Overproduction leads to gluts, speculation leads to bubbles, and inequality limits demand because too much wealth is concentrated at the top. When those contradictions can no longer be managed, the system crashes into crisis. This structural weakness is compounded by the way capitalism deals with its own failures. Instead of allowing a crisis to force deep changes, governments and elites intervene just enough to stabilize the system without altering its foundations. Bailouts for corporations, tax breaks for the wealthy, and austerity for the public are the usual prescriptions. These measures protect those at the top while shifting the pain onto ordinary people. As a result, the system never corrects its core dysfunctions. The very same mechanisms that produced the last crisis are left intact, guaranteeing another one in the future. We can see this clearly in the financial sector. The crash of 2008 was not an isolated event. It was the direct result of decades of deregulation, speculation, and reckless lending, all driven by the pursuit of short-term profit. The supposed lessons of that collapse were quickly forgotten. Instead of restructuring finance to serve social needs, governments stabilized the very institutions that had created the problem. Banks grew larger, speculation returned, and inequality worsened. The seeds of the next crisis were planted even before the last one was fully resolved. This cycle is not an anomaly. It is the predictable outcome of a system that puts private profit above public stability. Another flaw lies in the way capitalism prioritizes shareholders over stakeholders. Decisions are made with the goal of maximizing returns for owners and investors, not for workers, communities, or the environment. This narrow focus leads to destructive consequences. Jobs are offshored, industries are hollowed out, and environmental resources are exploited beyond repair. The immediate gains show up as corporate profits, but the long term costs, lost livelihoods, broken communities, climate change, are borne by society. These costs accumulate silently, and when they surface, they manifest as crises that appear sudden but are, in truth, decades in the making. Inequality itself is one of the deepest structural flaws. Capitalism has always generated disparities between those who own capital and those who depend on wages. Over time, these disparities grow wider, concentrating wealth in fewer hands. When too much wealth is locked up at the top, the majority cannot afford to consume enough to sustain the system. Demand falls short, businesses overproduce, and the result is economic stagnation. To mask this imbalance, societies encourage borrowing, creating an illusion of prosperity. But when debts become unsustainable, the illusion shatters and crisis emerges once more. This dynamic does not only harm economics, it destabilizes politics. As inequality deepens, frustration grows among those left behind. People lose faith in institutions, turn against traditional parties, and become vulnerable to extremist promises. The political polarization we see around the world today is not separate from the economic system. It is a direct byproduct of capitalism's structural flaws. When millions feel excluded from the benefits of growth, when they see the wealthy insulated from hardship, they seek alternatives, often in desperate and destructive ways. It is also important to understand that capitalism, by design, resists collective solutions. Problems like inequality, climate change, and global instability require cooperation, regulation, and long term planning. But capitalism rewards individual firms for acting in their own short term interest, even when those actions harm the collective. A corporation that pollutes to cut costs gains an advantage over one that invests in sustainability. A bank that speculates recklessly can reap enormous profits before its collapse harms the wider society. In this system, acting responsibly is often punished, while recklessness is rewarded until it triggers collapse. That is why crises are not accidents, but logical outcomes. The most sobering truth is that this crisis, like the ones before it, cannot be understood as a temporary disruption. It is not an external shock, but an internal feature. Capitalism, as structured, carries within it the seeds of its own recurring breakdowns. Each crisis is a signal that the system is not working for the majority, yet each time those in power act as though the problem lies only in a few bad policies or a few bad actors. The deeper reality is that the very logic of the system, endless accumulation, relentless competition, and disregard for social costs, ensures that crises will not only continue, but intensify. The most painful reality of any economic crisis is not found in the numbers on financial reports or the charts on television screens. It is found in the daily struggles of working people whose lives are turned upside down by forces they did not create and cannot control. When we speak of inflation, job insecurity, or rising debt, these are not abstract concepts. They translate directly into parents skipping meals so their children can eat, into families forced to choose between paying rent and buying medicine, into young graduates burdened with debts they cannot repay. The brunt of every economic downturn falls squarely on the shoulders of ordinary people, even though they are the ones least responsible for creating the crisis in the first place. Inflation is one of the clearest examples of this burden. When prices rise, workers have little ability to protect themselves. Their wages are usually fixed, and even when they demand raises, employers resist because higher wages cut into profits. Corporations, on the other hand, often take advantage of inflation by raising prices far beyond their actual costs, turning a crisis into an opportunity for record profits. The result is what many now call greedflation. While households stretch their budgets thinner and thinner, large companies celebrate higher earnings. This transfer of wealth from the many to the few intensifies inequality, leaving workers poorer in real terms even if their nominal wages remain the same. Debt compounds the pain. For decades, wages have stagnated while the costs of housing, education, and healthcare have soared. To bridge the gap, working people have been pushed into borrowing. Mortgages, student loans, credit cards, and personal loans have become a way of life. But in times of crisis, when jobs are uncertain and prices climb, debt becomes a trap. Interest payments swallow income, defaults rise, and the sense of being chained to obligations grows heavier. What was once presented as a path to opportunity, borrowing for a home, borrowing for education, becomes instead a mechanism of control that locks millions into cycles of insecurity. Job insecurity is another brutal reality. In times of economic stress, corporations quickly turn to layoffs, hiring freezes, and outsourcing as ways to protect profits. Workers become expendable, treated as costs to be cut rather than human beings with families to support. Even those who keep their jobs often face longer hours, fewer benefits, and relentless pressure to produce more with less. The supposed flexibility of the modern labor market, temporary contracts, gig work, freelancing, is often just a euphemism for instability. Workers shoulder all the risks while employers enjoy all the rewards. The promise of a steady job, a stable income, and a secure retirement has faded into uncertainty, replaced by a constant anxiety about what tomorrow will bring. The burden on working people also extends to their communities. When wages are stagnant and jobs unstable, local economies suffer. Small businesses close because customers cannot afford to spend. Public services deteriorate as tax revenues fall, leading to underfunded schools, overstretched hospitals, and crumbling infrastructure. The crisis spreads outward from the individual household to the collective life of entire neighborhoods. What begins as financial strain becomes a social unraveling, eroding trust, security, and hope. Young people in particular face a bleak landscape. They are told to pursue higher education as the key to opportunity, but they emerge from universities with mountains of debt and few stable jobs waiting for them. They are told to work hard and save, yet housing prices make ownership unattainable and rent consumes a disproportionate share of their income. They are told to prepare for the future, but they inherit a world where climate crisis, political instability, and economic volatility are the norm. For many young people, the dream of progress, the belief that they will live better lives than their parents, is slipping away. Meanwhile, older generations who have worked their entire lives find their retirements threatened. Pension funds tied to financial markets rise and fall with speculation, leaving seniors uncertain about their future security. Healthcare costs mount just as incomes decline, forcing painful choices about how to age with dignity. After decades of contribution, many find themselves once again struggling to make ends meet, their stability shattered by forces beyond their control. The cruelest part of this dynamic is that working people are constantly told that sacrifice is necessary. They are asked to tighten belts during downturns, to accept wage freezes, to work harder for less. Yet, when prosperity returns, the benefits are not shared, profits flow upward, executive bonuses swell, and stockholders reap the rewards. Ordinary workers who bore the costs of the crisis are left behind. This pattern of sacrifice without reward is not just unfair, it is unsustainable. It breeds resentment, distrust, and anger because people can see with their own eyes that the system is not designed to serve them. Beyond economics, the burden also weighs heavily on mental and physical health. Stress from financial insecurity contributes to anxiety, depression, and illness. Families fracture under the pressure. Communities plagued by unemployment see rises in addiction, crime, and despair. The human toll of crisis cannot be measured in GDP figures or market indices. It is measured in lost potential, in broken spirits, in the quiet suffering of millions who feel powerless in the face of forces too large to resist. At its core, the crisis exposes a fundamental imbalance. Risks and burdens are socialized downward, while rewards and protections are privatized upward. The system ensures that when things go well, the wealthy gain the most, but when things go badly, it is workers and their families who endure the pain. This imbalance is not accidental. It is the predictable outcome of an economy structured to prioritize profits over people. And it is precisely this imbalance that makes every crisis not just an economic event, but a deeply human tragedy for those who do the real work of holding society together. One of the most troubling features of the crisis is not only its severity, but also the way it is being handled by those in positions of power. The failures of leadership and policy are as significant as the structural weaknesses of the system itself. At moments when bold action is required, what we too often witness instead are half measures, empty rhetoric, and attempts to mask reality rather than confront it. Leaders, whether political figures, corporate executives, or financial elites, tend to prioritize short-term stability and appearances over long-term solutions. This pattern of avoidance and denial is part of why the crisis grows deeper and why the public increasingly feels abandoned. Governments are quick to reassure their citizens that recovery is around the corner. They point to selective statistics, celebrating stock market highs or slight dips in unemployment while ignoring the widening inequality, precarious work conditions, and declining living standards experienced by the majority. By focusing on narrow indicators, they create the illusion of progress as though the economy is moving in a healthy direction. Yet the day-to-day reality for ordinary people tells a very different story. This disconnect between official narratives and lived experience erodes public trust and exposes the superficiality of leadership responses. Part of the problem lies in the relationship between political leaders and corporate interests. Too often, policies are crafted not to serve the broad public, but to protect the wealth and power of those at the top. Bailouts are directed to banks and corporations. Subsidies are extended to industries that fuel inequality, and tax codes are structured to reward those already wealthy. Meanwhile, the working population is told to wait patiently for benefits to trickle down, a promise that rarely materializes. This alignment of political decisions with corporate priorities ensures that the deepest flaws of the system remain untouched. Leaders protect the status quo rather than challenging it because their own positions of influence are tied to it. Even when policies are introduced with the stated goal of relief, they are often temporary patches rather than structural reforms. Stimulus checks may provide short term breathing room, but they do not address stagnant wages or unaffordable housing. Interest rate adjustments may slow inflation, but they also make borrowing more expensive for households already struggling with debt. Leaders reach for the same limited toolkit of measures that have failed in past crises, applying them again in hopes that this time the outcome will be different. These approaches may calm markets temporarily, but they do little to change the underlying dynamics that produced the crisis in the first place. Corporate leadership plays its own role in this failure. At a time when people need stability and investment in productive activity, corporations focus on share buybacks, dividend payouts, and mergers that concentrate power rather than create opportunity. Executives justify mass layoffs as necessary efficiency measures, even while awarding themselves bonuses. These decisions are celebrated in financial markets as signs of discipline, yet they come at the expense of workers and communities. In this way, corporate strategies align with political inaction, reinforcing a cycle in which the well-being of the majority is consistently sacrificed for the benefit of a minority. The media, often influenced by both political and corporate power, contributes by framing crises in ways that obscure responsibility. They focus on immediate events, rising prices, interest rate changes, or stock fluctuations, without connecting them to deeper structural causes. The public is left to believe that crises are sudden and unpredictable rather than the logical outcomes of long standing policies and systemic choices. By failing to provide context, media coverage shields leadership from accountability and normalizes the idea that little can be done beyond waiting for markets to correct themselves. Another dimension of failed leadership is the reluctance to think beyond national borders. In a globalized economy, crises are interconnected. Supply chains, energy markets, financial systems all operate across borders. Yet leaders frequently retreat into narrow nationalism, framing problems as purely domestic while ignoring their international roots. This short sighted approach leads to fragmented policies that fail to address the global nature of the crisis. Instead of cooperation and collective problem solving, nations compete, hoard resources, and blame one another. The lack of coordinated leadership ensures that crises spread more easily and are harder to contain. These failures are not merely accidental. They reflect the limits of leadership within a system designed to protect itself. Political leaders rely on campaign funding and lobbying from corporations, making them hesitant to challenge entrenched interests. Corporate leaders are rewarded for maximizing short term profits, not for building long term stability. Media outlets depend on advertising revenue from the very institutions they should scrutinize. Together, these forces create an environment where addressing the roots of the crisis is discouraged and managing appearances is prioritized. The human cost of these failures is profound. People who might have been shielded from the worst effects of the crisis are left exposed. Families lose homes because housing policies favor developers and landlords rather than tenants. Workers endure layoffs because leaders refuse to regulate outsourcing or invest in sustainable industries. Communities deteriorate because tax breaks starve public budgets of the resources needed to maintain infrastructure and services. These outcomes are not inevitable, they are the consequences of choices made by those in power. Every crisis is an opportunity to rethink and reform, but when leadership avoids accountability, opportunities are wasted. Instead of asking why the same patterns repeat, leaders insist on returning to business as usual. The result is not stability but fragility, as the same mistakes are repeated until they produce even greater disruptions. The cycle continues: denial, superficial response, temporary calm, then deeper crisis. It is this cycle that reveals the true failure of leadership, for crises that could have been opportunities for transformation are instead reduced to moments of survival for those in power and suffering for everyone else. When a society faces a crisis as deep and far reaching as the one unfolding today, the instinct of many in power is to preserve the existing order. They insist that the system only needs minor adjustments, a new policy here or there, or perhaps a bit more patience before growth resumes. But such approaches fail to recognize the scale of the challenge. Real solutions require something much larger than temporary fixes. They demand a rethinking of our economic priorities, a rebalancing of power, and a willingness to construct alternatives that serve people instead of profits. Without this shift, the same patterns of inequality and instability will persist, producing one crisis after another. At the heart of meaningful change lies the question of who holds power in the economy. For generations, decision making has been concentrated in the hands of corporate executives, financial elites, and political leaders closely tied to them. Ordinary workers, the very people who create the goods, deliver the services, and sustain society, are excluded from the decisions that shape their lives. If the burden of crisis falls most heavily on working people, then justice requires that they also play a central role in shaping solutions. Empowering workers is not only a moral imperative, it is a practical necessity. When people have a say in the economic decisions that affect them, priorities shift towards stability, fairness, and sustainability rather than short-term profit extraction. This empowerment can take many forms. Worker cooperatives, for example, replace the traditional hierarchy of corporations with democratic governance. Instead of profits flowing only to shareholders, they are distributed among those who actually do the work. Decisions about investment, wages, and working conditions are made collectively, ensuring that economic activity serves the community rather than distant investors. Such models have already proven viable in many parts of the world, demonstrating that alternatives to corporate capitalism are not theoretical. They exist and they work. Scaling them up could provide resilience against the very instabilities that define the current system. Rethinking priorities also requires challenging the assumption that endless growth is the ultimate goal of an economy. For decades, policy has been guided by the pursuit of higher GDP as if it were synonymous with progress. But growth alone tells us nothing about who benefits, how wealth is distributed, or what is sacrificed along the way. A society can grow rapidly while destroying its environment, eroding its public services, and leaving millions in poverty. A new approach would prioritize well-being, equality, and sustainability over raw expansion. That means investing in healthcare, education, renewable energy and infrastructure, not because they boost profits, but because they improve the lives of people. Another part of the solution lies in rebuilding the social safety net. Crises expose how fragile life is when basic needs depend entirely on volatile markets. Affordable housing, accessible health care, quality education, and reliable pensions should not be privileges, they should be guaranteed rights. When people are secure in these essentials, they are less vulnerable to the shocks of crisis and more able to contribute productively to society. Policies like universal health care, tuition, free education, and guaranteed minimum incomes are not radical luxuries. They are rational responses to the failures of a system that leaves millions struggling in times of abundance. Environmental sustainability must also be placed at the center of solutions. The current system treats the natural world as an infinite resource to be exploited for profit, with little regard for long term consequences. Climate change, pollution, and resource depletion are not external to the economic crisis, they are integral parts of it. Any attempt to build a stable and just future must align economic activity with ecological limits. That means transitioning away from fossil fuels, investing in green technologies, and designing industries that regenerate rather than deplete. The alternative is to allow environmental breakdown to amplify economic instability, creating crises even greater than the one we now face. Real solutions also demand greater accountability for those in positions of wealth and power. For too long, corporate elites have been able to privatize gains while socializing losses. They profit during booms and rely on public bailouts during busts. This cycle is sustained by a tax system that favors the wealthy, by deregulation that frees corporations from responsibility, and by political influence that shields them from accountability. Breaking this cycle requires progressive taxation, strict regulation of industries that pose systemic risks, and transparency in both corporate and political life. Only when elites are held accountable can trust in institutions begin to be restored. The challenge, of course, is that those benefiting from the current arrangement will resist change. They will argue that alternatives are unrealistic, that markets are the only efficient way to organize society, and that any shift in priorities will harm prosperity. But history shows that change is not only possible, it is inevitable when people organize and demand it. Labor movements, civil rights struggles, and social reforms of the past all emerge from periods of crisis when ordinary people refuse to accept the status quo. The same potential exists today if enough people recognize the depth of the problem and the need for systemic transformation. Change can be forced from below, even when resisted from above. This is not to suggest that transformation will be easy. It requires courage to imagine a different way of organizing society, determination to challenge entrenched interests, and patience to build alternatives step by step. But the alternative to change is the continuation of a cycle that has already proven devastating: repeated crises, widening inequality, environmental degradation, and the erosion of democratic life. If the present crisis feels worse than those before it, that is because the costs of inaction have accumulated. Each failure to act deepens the hole, making eventual solutions harder and more urgent. The real question, then, is not whether change is possible, but whether it will be pursued with clarity and resolve. If society continues to rely on the same leadership, the same policies, and the same priorities, the outcome is already clear: more crises, more inequality, more instability. But if society chooses to confront the roots of the problem, to empower workers, rethink growth, rebuild the safety net, prioritize sustainability, and demand accountability, then the crisis can become a turning point. What looks like a moment of despair can instead become the catalyst for building a system that truly serves people and protects their future. What we face today is not a passing challenge, not a temporary storm to be waited out. It is a crisis that exposes the deepest weaknesses of our system. We have seen how its hidden depth is far greater than we are told, how its roots lie in structural flaws that make instability inevitable, how its burden falls hardest on working people, how leaders have failed us with denial and short sighted policies, and how real solutions demand nothing less than transformation. This moment calls for honesty, courage, and resolve. We cannot afford to be comforted by illusions or distracted by promises of quick fixes. The truth is plain: unless we change course, crises will continue to return, each time more damaging than the last. But if we act, if we demand accountability, if we empower workers, if we put people and sustainability at the center of our priorities, then this crisis can become not only a warning, but a turning point. The choice is ours: to accept a future of recurring instability and deepening inequality, or to create a future built on fairness, security, and collective well being. History will remember what path we chose. Thank you.